So a couple things that I neglected to mention in my personal journey video, my own long dark night of the soul video, related to reversion and the reversion process, is that I'd mentioned that many reverts are seeking truth, and they're brought into Islam in some very interesting ways sometimes. Um, but something that we need to consider is that so they've already gone through a process where maybe they were looking at their Christianity very carefully, reading the Bible, exploring various Christianities, or maybe it could be looking at Hinduism or whatever they were in previously, or atheism, and then they looked at it very sincerely and studying it from different angles, and then they they took Shahada and entered into the Ummah. And in this process, and it had probably already begun before becoming Muslim, they, in many cases, lose their their friends, their family, their social networks, sometimes work opportunities. They lose so much in this process. It's a very heavy loss that they have to undergo as they become Muslims, um, and then sometimes there's a love bombing process, like that happens in a cult situation, where people are, like the revert is made to feel so welcome and taken care of initially, and it might go on for a few days or a few weeks or whatever, and it feels really good, and it feels like they've found what they were looking for. And then they start to see hypocrisies and problems within the ummah, within their experience. They see the tensions and the problems between Muslims who have, like, say, a Sufi perspective, a Salafi perspective, a Shia perspective, whatever it might be. But we hear, people disrespecting one another's groups, one another's ways of life, and this is like, people always talk about Islam so simple, and from a certain perspective, it can be simplified. It's like 5 pillars, Tawheed. It sounds simple and all, but it's not simple in the least. I've been studying religion for years, and I don't feel that I really, really have my head wrapped around a concept as simple as worship. What is worship? I'm still trying to see what this might actually mean. And so people tell you that Islam's so simple, and then you've got hundreds of thousands of hadith in these various hadith collections, and some of the hadith are quite problematic. If you have, taken a path of ethics and purity, of truth seeking, and then you find out that people actually are rationalizing and making apologies for things that are completely unethical that are in hadith about the Prophet, peace be upon him, and it winds up being very, very, there are all kinds of turmoils and difficulties that an individual will go through, and I know many born Muslims are going through these things as we speak, and people just, within the Ummah, you've got a lot of people just doubling down, and they're like, well, that's just, it's very difficult for people to deal with. And it's very psychologically and spiritually challenging. And when you've got a situation and you find out that it's the Islamic sciences are very, very sophisticated, very complex. It would take lifetimes to sift through the information. And maybe we just need a solid spiritual framework to work with. And maybe we're wary of following scholars and blind following. Like, that's very, very problematic from a Western perspective. for a lot of people, like, because we've seen the dangers inherent within the various Christianities, with the priesthoods and with these intermediaries. And when you see a scholarly tradition that is actually a rabbinic system, this is highly problematic, especially if you grew up within a Christian context where we're raised to be very wary of rabbinic frameworks and of priesthoods, whether they be scholarly priesthoods or religious priesthoods. So these things, this complexity is challenging. And then so the thing is, another aspect is that when we come into the Ummah, we often have certain videos that we've watched, scholars that we've listened to, maybe their tapes or their CDs back in the day, videos, YouTube videos, whatever, lectures. So we have certain people, like a lot of Westerners, they look to particular shayukh that were reverts, or they grew up in a Western context. And then you go onto YouTube, you go onto Facebook, you go onto the WhatsApp and Telegram groups, and I mean, like, it is vicious. People, like, Muslims are vicious on these forums and within the comments. And they're calling people, like, so you see the shayukh on YouTube constantly making takfir and calling people horrible things, sometimes directly, often indirectly, but you know who they're talking about. And it's very disrespectful and dishonorable. And and what it's doing is it's pulling the rug from underneath the Muslimin, and then the reverts and the born Muslims who are going through a questioning process, which is natural and should be encouraged to go and come into our maturity and become critical thinking human beings that have expansive hearts. And so it's very, very challenging to see these sheikhs, these scholars, disrespected by other scholars and by many Muslims that are very vocal and very comfortable being vocal in comments and in these forums, calling people, kafirs, jahils, like they're ignorant, they're deviant, they're apostate. And then we know that there are many Muslims that have this strong belief that if somebody is left Islam or is a kafir, that their blood is now called for and even warranted, and that if somebody in the state can't do it, then somebody that a Muslim could go and do violence or damage to somebody. So it's like these scholars who are making takfir, they know exactly what they're doing. And they are putting people and their families in danger every single time they make takfir. Because this is the other point I wanted to make, is that when takfir is made, directly or indirectly, what it does is it's not just attacking that scholar and his loved ones who may be harmed by an unstable Muslim who has been engaged in tremendous sin and then thinks he can have a free get into heaven card. And that all his alcoholism and his drug abuse and his womanizing and his homosexuality or whatever it might be that he was engaged in that he feels guilty about, he feels like he can get a clear slate by taking the life of this deviant who's misleading Muslims. Because the scholars have said this scholar is a kafir. That 40, 50, 60 years of scholarship is invalidated by sentences that they spoke in some lecture. Sometimes taken out of context, sometimes misunderstood. And one of the things that we need to consider, besides this danger, is that many of the reverts and the born Muslims who are seeking knowledge wholeheartedly and sincerely. And they're taking knowledge from these various scholars that are being called names and being disrespected. The thing is, anytime we see somebody who has influenced us or impacted us in any way, in a positive way, something that we perceive as positive, and has provided some kind of guidance or inspiration in our lives, and then we see them attacked, like being called names and their worldviews, their teachings being dishonored, disrespected, it winds up being personalized, because what happens is that is a mirror and we can see ourselves in that. Because oftentimes, part of the reason we became a Muslim is maybe we saw, like, there are many Western Muslims and born Muslims who they saw Sheikh Hamza Yusuf and Sheikh Imran Hussein, and they saw themselves in that person, their knowledge seeking, their truth seeking, their appetite for Islamic knowledge and vaster knowledge, for seeking to understand the eschaton and the end times, for seeking to understand Quran and to organize our life according to certain principles. And then we see these people attacked and called so many horrific names by so many different Muslims online. And then we see ourselves in that and we recognize, you know what, all these people, these thousands of people commenting and thumbs upping and whatnot, they're attacking me personally. They are, they're calling me a kafir. They're calling me a munafiq. They're disrespecting me because I believe many of those same things. Like, my life path has brought me to have similar understandings or similar views, perhaps. Or maybe I have even views that are outside of what these people think, because that's another thing. When you are a revert, you are not an empty vessel. This is literally impossible. However, in cults, they want you to empty yourself of all previous data, all previous inputs, so that they can fill you up and brainwash you. And there are literally cults within all of the monotheistic religions. There are outsiders who say that's what the monotheistic religions are cultic systems. And I can see the truth of that to a certain extent. And this is very, very important to consider that, these many Muslims, they act as if you need to be empty of all prior content. But the reality is that we come into Islam with all of our previous experiences that led us to Islam. And oftentimes Islam becomes a refining process. Islamicizing can be a refining process, where maybe we are in a broken state in certain respects, and then perhaps Islam provided certain glue or threads that help us to sew our lives back together and come and be made whole or have certain views made whole or refined. So we need to consider, and the thing is, reverts always bring something very important to the ummah, always. I was just speaking earlier today about how oftentimes when you're talking about imperialism, if you have a conquering army that's part of an imperial project, the conquering group often is conquered by the ones that they supposedly defeated. So, for instance, in Central Asia and in the Eastern Persian lands, many of the peoples there, before they joined the Ummah, some forcefully, some through conversion, some through various pressures, and through cost-benefit analysis and through the carrot and the stick, they entered into the Ummah with 1,000 to 2,000 years of Buddhist history, where through nature and nurture, all the various inputs of various contemplation practices, ethical practices had impacted their genetic clay beds, energetic imprints, through various practices over long periods of time that then also, so we've got nature and nurture, we got the genetics, the genetic and energetic imprints, and we've got the moral and ethical upbringing within family and community. And so we've got maybe 1,000 to 2,000 years of Buddhism, of Buddha Dhamma, having impacted people to a great extent. And then they become Muslim. And then that's how they read the Quran. They read the Quran through Buddhist lenses, like focusing on mercy, on compassion, on wisdom. They see the importance of breath and of mantra, perhaps. And so when they recite dhikr, they did it within the framework of what they had learned for 1,000, 2,000 years. And It's interesting because I see a way to resolve some of the conflict related to the Orientalists. So many of the Orientalists, they claimed that Islam was that the Sufis were like an infiltration of Islam, or secret Buddhists, secret Christians, and that had an influence. And then you've got people who are very defensive in these respects, and know that the Wahhabis were very anti-Sufi. The Shia, many of them were very anti-Sufi. Then later, the modernists and Salafis were very anti-Sufi. So people who have an interest in preserving Sufism or Tasawwuf within a certain framework. They rejected the Orientalist perspectives and doubled down on, hey, this is completely from the Sahaba. This is from the early days. Our Nabi, peace be upon him, he was the great Sufi master. He is, and then all of the prophets were Sufi masters, so to speak. And this is an ancient tradition it comes to its maturation and culmination within an Islamic framework. And it was completely present within the early Islamic community, the Hijazi, Meccan, and Medinan communities. And I see that as I can see that perspective. But at the same time, it's interesting because I see the genetic aspect of when people revert. They've got all of the imprints from those who came before them. And they have imprints from their moral, ethical, and social historical context of growing up. So nature and nurture play a role. And then they come into the Ummah with those imprints, and then they read Islam they read the Quran through those lenses. So for instance, it's arguable that many of the people who are interpreting Islam right now come from like 1,500 years plus of being Jahili imprints. So coming from a Jahiliya background that imprinted their genetics and their socio-historical constructs and their morals and ethics, and they have read Islam for all of this time in ways that many people who've been following the prophetic tradition very strongly for much longer than them would argue are deviant from the prophetic tradition and ugly and disgusting and hard-hearted and have no business, within this prophetic context. So people are bringing Jahili nature and nurture into their readings of Deen and their expression within the Ummah. And then people who are reverting in, who come from, say, a long Christian background, or a long Buddhist background, or a long Hindu background. And then Hindu, it's very complex because it's many different. So for instance, if a person is Vaishnavite, then they had hardcore Mahayana Buddhist inputs. A lot of them that came from a vegetarian background that was from the Mahayana Buddhist input, not the Theravada as much. This is very sophisticated, very complex, but my whole point is that nature and nurture impacts the revert's worldview. And then when they come into the Ummah with these inputs, these things are often rejected and very viciously. And like I said, when we read the comments, we see the evil, the really cruel videos that are put out against people that we have come to respect and honor and think highly of. And we might have our own issues with those particular people about certain silences that they've had the past couple years, or certain things that they spoke that may have caused people to prematurely do something from, like all kinds of problems. But then we see that they're being attacked, and then it makes us question ourselves and question our Islam. Like, this is very, very common. We need to very, very much consider the damage that these takfiris are doing. And they're making people want to leave the Ummah and at least distance themselves from the Muslims, because they feel threatened by the Muslims energetically, physically, emotionally, intellectually. And this is the Ummah should, we have so much potential as a collective, and as as a conflagration of many different peoples from many backgrounds. You know, Allah has created us different colors, different languages, different nationalities so that we would know one another. How do we know one another? Through comparing and contrasting. And how do we reconcile with, like, how can we call ourselves, like, I mean, like non-Muslims, they actually sarcastically, they make fun of Muslims, the da'is who had previously gone out of their way to say Islam is the religion of peace. And then there's so much evidence to the contrary of this that, you know, it's very problematic for any self-respecting Muslim to really look at it, because we might personally say, you know, I'm striving to live a peaceful lifestyle, and you know, I view Islam as a way of peace. And then, but we see what's going on within the ummah, the broader ummah, and we see it as high. And then many people, they just blame others. Well, we're not a religion of peace because, you know, because of this group or that group or this society. It's the West. It's this little place on the map. It's whatever it might be. It's Khazari. It's whatever. It's always somebody else. It's the Shia. It's the Sunnis. It's the Sufis. It's the Salafis. It's always somebody else is the problem. And I'm just saying that many contemplative, knowledge-seeking, truth-seeking, born Muslims and reverts are having a very difficult time living within the ummah right now. And many reverts have already lost it all, and now to be threatened with death if you leave Islam, if you question things, if you think about things in an out-of-the-box manner. To you know, it's like, at the very least, to be disrespected and harangued and you know, I mean, like I've seen that there are many unstable people in the whole world right now. Right now, people have been pushed into mental illness through isolation, through the unhealthy processed foods that they've been eating, through chemical alterants within the air and the soil, adulterants within the pesticides, the herbicides, the genetic modifications are having impacts on our biological organisms, our organic being, that's destabilizing people and making people go off the hinges. And this is very present within the ummah. And we have to consider the potentiality of this. I mean, it's devastating. And like my intention is to bring these threads together in a more succinct manner. But this issue of reversion, and of you know, also like on behalf of the born Muslims that are dealing with the same kind of issues. No wonder people are leaving the ummah and actively seeking to distance themselves from the word Islam, from the word Muslim. They don't want to be associated with closed-mindedness, with closed-heartedness, and certainly not with closed-fistedness. And yeah, like a lot of people are very aware that things that have gone on in Iraq and Syria and Libya have other inputs and other people that are connected to this, but it's very complex. But the ummah is sick, and the ummah is suicidal. And the ummah is right now annihilating itself. And the sheikhs, the shiuk, are leading the way. They are attacking one another in an unprecedented... Matter of fact, it's not unprecedented. Matter of fact, it's been here for a long time. There are many precedents. You can see, just go and look up, somebody who's much more knowledgeable can break it down, but there is a ridiculous number of instances where scholars have been imprisoned by secular leaders who are working with other religious scholars that are in opposition to one another from the various madhabs, from the non-madhabi traditions, etc. And so there are precedents for things that we're dealing with, but we're about to see things come to a head potentially. And I think that we need to really take a close look in the mirror and think about which direction we want to head as a community. Because right now, we've got a mind virus that leads to a heart sickness within the Ummah. It is a big problem. And I would argue that there's a lot of dog-like behaviors, a pack mentality that's wolf-like. And many of these people are in sheep's clothing, and they go in for the kill, and they are, they're going after individuals that also represent groups. And it's very, very devastating. I would call this the Sufyani mind virus, the dog tribe. And I'm not talking about a historical genetic group. I'm talking about an energetic tribe, a spiritual, cancerous collective that happens to have had a lot of financing. Very strong financiers over the past 2-3 centuries, it looks like, perhaps longer, that was intended to be time-release destruction to annihilate the Ummah at the same time that the church is annihilated, and at the same time that various communities are annihilated and annihilating one another in various ways, including on the digital forums, real world to some extent, sometimes through proxy wars, sometimes direct conflict. It's arguable that some people, we've been in World War III for quite some time, and arguably it's all the same world war that has been ongoing for literally 100 years, maybe longer. So I'm going to go ahead and draw this one to a close. But, the thing is, it's like, I talk about various aspects of Islam all the time because, I love the prophetic path of purification and perfection, the path of spiritual maturation, and I've come to call it Islam. I see it as this is the Islamic path, and the state of surrender to truth is the state of the Muslim. And so it's interesting that the ways that I initially read the Quran in interpretation, translation, or whatever you might call it, that this is actually, I've come full circle. And when I read the criticisms, like within the Quran, when you hear the criticisms of the ignorant ones, the Jahili ones, of the hypocrites, of the ungrateful ones, what I was seeing is that the Quran is completely, it's like all the problems that I saw within the Ummah, I read it as it's actually literally talking to the Ummah right now. And that everything was going to be stripped away if the Muslims didn't correct themselves. But I read the Quran and Allah was speaking directly to my heart. And I read the Quran many times prayerfully. When I would read something about righteousness and excellent, healthy, righteous qualities, moral and ethical behaviors, I would pray that Allah would transform me in this way and show me what righteousness really is, and help me to align my life accordingly. And to be kind-hearted, to be merciful, to be loving. Every time I read Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, I prayed that Allah would make me merciful and compassionate. When I read about wisdom, I asked that Allah would make me wise. When I read about knowledge, I asked that He would make me knowledgeable. And now I pray these things for the Ummah as a whole. May Allah make us merciful. May Allah make us compassionate. May Allah make us knowledgeable and wise and just. And when I would read about negative qualities, of hypocrisy, of ingratitude, I would pray that Allah would make me among the appreciative and the grateful, and not among the inappreciative, not among the ungrateful. That Allah would help me to see sin for what it really is, and help to protect me from it, so that I would see how to avoid it and recognize what its remedies were. What are the remedies to sin? How can we protect ourselves and purify ourselves of it? So I read the Quran prayerfully again and again and again. And I'm very thankful it was transformative. So, and it was personal. And what I came to realize over time is that we all have the prophetic reality within us. And so when it's speaking to the prophets about the prophets, it's speaking of something that's encoded in us genetically, spiritually, energetically. It's all encoded within us. It's all present within us. When you're offering salams to the prophet, you have a direct connection to the prophet in your heart. You're not separate from him. You're not separate from any of the prophets. Peace be upon all of them. And Allah does not discriminate between the prophets. So why are we discriminating between the prophets? We need to be transformed. We need to be made whole, to come out of our broken state and be made upright. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and cut this short, but you're loved and appreciated. Until next time, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.